The glass doors of First Continental Bank swung open at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning, and a tall man in work boots and an oil-stained jacket walked in holding a folded check, like it was the most fragile thing he owned. His name was Marcus Reed. He was 41 years old, a single father, and for the first time in 9 years, he was about to walk out of a bank with more money than he'd ever seen in his life, or so he thought. He didn't know that in the next 4 minutes, a woman in a gray blazer was going to look at him, decide who he was before he said a single word, and tear that check into pieces in front of 11 strangers. He didn't know that 15 minutes after that, the regional director of the entire bank would walk through those same doors, see him standing there, and say 2 words that would change everything. Mr. Reed. Sir. But that morning began like every other morning in Marcus Reed's life, with him just trying to do right by his daughter, and hoping quietly that today would be a little easier than yesterday. Stay with this story until the end, because what happens in that bank lobby is only the beginning. This is a story about being underestimated, about dignity that refuses to break, and about the moment the truth finally speaks louder than anyone's assumptions. 3 years earlier, Marcus Reed's world had been split in half. His wife, Danielle, died on a Thursday in March, a blood clot, the doctor said, quiet and sudden, the kind of thing nobody sees coming. One morning she was making coffee and humming along to the radio, and 3 days later Marcus was standing in a funeral home picking out a casket, while his 6-year-old daughter, Amara, sat in the waiting room coloring a picture of the 3 of them holding hands. After that, it was just the 2 of them. Marcus worked as a machinist at a small manufacturing shop on the industrial side of town, the kind of place with concrete floors and the smell of cutting oil that never quite left your hands no matter how hard you scrubbed. He'd been there since he was 22, learning the trade from a foreman who used to say that a man who respected his tools would never be short of work. Marcus believed that. He respected everything, his tools, his co-workers, the old machines nobody else wanted to fix, and most of all, his daughter. Their apartment was small, 2 bedrooms above a laundromat, with a window unit that rattled through the summer and radiators that clanked all winter. Marcus kept it clean. He kept Amara's shoes lined up by the door, her homework folder on the kitchen table every night, and a jar on top of the refrigerator where he dropped whatever spare dollar he could after rent, after groceries, after the light bill. He called it the someday jar. Someday, a better apartment. Someday, a car that didn't need a prayer to start in the winter. Someday, maybe, a life where he wasn't doing the math in his head every time Amara asked for something at the store. He never let her see the math. Every night, no matter how tired he was from a 10-hour shift, he sat with her at the kitchen table and helped with her reading homework, tracing his finger under the words the way his own mother used to do for him. Amara was 9 now, sharp as anything, always asking questions that made Marcus laugh even on his hardest days. She wanted to be an engineer, she told him. Like you, Daddy, but with a degree. Marcus never went to college. He didn't need to. What he had was something rarer, a mind that saw problems in metal and motion the way other people saw problems in numbers. For years, in the back corner of the machine shop after his shift ended, he'd been quietly working on something of his own. A modification to an industrial safety valve, the kind used in manufacturing plants and water treatment systems, one that could detect pressure failures nearly 4 seconds faster than anything currently on the market. 4 seconds didn't sound like much. But his old foreman, Walt, who'd seen a plant accident take a man's hand back in the 90s, told him 4 seconds was the difference between an incident report and a funeral. The idea had come to him almost by accident, on a night 18 months after Danielle passed, when the shop had run a late shift and one of the older presses had thrown a pressure fault that nobody caught in time. No one was hurt, barely, but Marcus stood there afterward staring at the gauge, running the numbers in his head, and couldn't stop thinking about how close barely had actually been. He started sketching ideas on the backs of receipts. Then on a second-hand notebook, Amara helped him pick out at the dollar store, because she said, "Inventors need a real notebook. Daddy, not paper towels." He'd laughed at that, but he bought the notebook, and for the next year it barely left his jacket pocket. Walt, the old foreman who'd trained him, was the first person Marcus showed the design to. Walt was pushing 70 by then, half retired, coming in twice a week mostly out of habit and loyalty to a shop that had given him 40 years of his life. He looked at Marcus's sketches for a long time without saying anything, turning the notebook sideways, tracing the sensor placement with one thick finger. "You know what this does that the current ones don't?" Walt finally said. "Reads the fault before the pressure spike hits critical," Marcus said. "Not after." 4 seconds, Walt said. "Maybe 5, depending on the line." 4 to 5 seconds, Marcus agreed. Walt closed the notebook and handed it back to him carefully, like it was something that deserved to be handled with both hands. "I watched a man lose his hand on a floor just like this one, back in '96, he said. 4 seconds would have saved it. "You understand what I'm telling you, Marcus? Don't let this sit in a drawer. Whatever it cost you to get this right, it's worth it." That conversation stayed with Marcus through every rejected application, every confusing legal form. Every night he sat at the library with a stack of borrowed patent law books, trying to translate government language into something he could actually use. He filed the patent himself, teaching himself the process late at night after Amara went to bed, using library computers because he didn't own one. It took him 2 years of paperwork, rejections, and resubmissions. He almost gave up more than once. After the second rejection, he sat in his truck for almost an hour before he could make himself go back inside and face Amara with anything close to a smile. But he kept going, the same way he kept going with everything, quietly, stubbornly, without asking anyone to notice. And then, 6 weeks ago, everything changed. A large industrial safety manufacturer, one whose name was stamped on equipment in half the plants across the state, had reached out. They wanted to license his design. Not buy it outright. License it, with royalties, with his name attached as the inventor, with the kind of contract that made Marcus read it 4 times before he believed the numbers were real. $5 million. An initial licensing payment, the first of what the contract called ongoing royalty structures. Marcus had cried in his truck after signing it. Not from joy, not exactly, from something heavier and quieter than joy. He thought about Danielle, about the someday jar, about every night he'd told Amara that things would get better and hoped he wasn't lying. Today was the day he was finally going to deposit that check. He'd worn his cleanest jacket, the one without oil stains on the sleeves, but by habit more than anything. He still looked like exactly what he was, a man who worked with his hands for a living. He didn't own a suit. He'd never needed one. He folded the check carefully into his jacket pocket, kissed Amara on the forehead before dropping her at school, and told her he had a good feeling about today. He had no idea how wrong that feeling would turn out to be. Not because the day would end badly, but because of what he'd have to walk through first. The bank was busier than Marcus expected for a Tuesday morning. A handful of customers stood in line at the teller counter, and near the back, a row of glass-walled offices held the bank's management staff, visible but separated, like fish in a tank. Marcus took his place in line, check in hand, and waited. When it was his turn, he stepped up to the counter and greeted the young teller with a warm, "Good morning." He slid the check across the counter along with his ID. The teller, a young man named Corey, looked at the check, then looked at the number written on it, and his eyebrows lifted so fast Marcus almost laughed. $5 million, Corey said slowly, like he needed to hear it out loud to believe the ink. "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "Licensing payment? I'll have the paperwork if you need it. Contract, patent documentation, all of it's in my bag here." Corey nodded, clearly out of his depth for a transaction this size, and did exactly what he was trained to do. "Let me get my manager." "One moment, please." That was when Diane Whitfield walked over. Diane had been branch manager at First Continental for 6 years. She ran a tight branch, hit her numbers, and prided herself on what she called protecting the bank's integrity, a phrase she used often, usually right before she made someone feel small. She took the check from Corey without a word to Marcus first. She looked at it. Then she looked at Marcus, his jacket, his work boots, the faint gray smudge of machine oil still visible along one knuckle. No amount of washing had gotten out. And something in her face changed. "This check," she said, holding it up between two fingers like it might be contaminated, "is for $5 million. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said evenly. "I have documentation." "Where did you get this?" she interrupted. Marcus kept his voice calm, the way he always did, the way his mother had taught him to when the world looked at him sideways. "It's a licensing payment. For a patent I hold. I have the full contract right here if you'd like to review it." Diane didn't reach for the folder he was holding out. Instead, she turned the check over, examining it the way someone examines something they've already decided is fake. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said, loud enough that two customers in line glanced over. "We see checks like this. Fraudulent cashier's checks, scam deposits. It happens more than people think. And frankly, this," she gestured vaguely toward him, toward his jacket, "doesn't look like someone who just received a $5 million business payment." The lobby went quiet. An older woman near the second teller window, waiting to cash her pension check, glanced over with a look Marcus recognized instantly. Not surprise, exactly. Something closer to recognition, the tired kind that comes from having seen this particular scene before, just wearing different faces. Marcus felt the heat rise in his chest, but he kept his hands still at his sides. He thought of Amara, of the 10,000 small ways he'd taught her to hold her head up, even when the world tried to make her feel small. And he understood that whatever happened in the next few minutes, he owed it to her to practice what he preached. "Ma'am, I understand you have to be careful," he said, "but I have the patent number, the licensing agreement, the company's legal contact, everything you need to verify this in 5 minutes." "I don't have 5 minutes to entertain something that's clearly not legitimate," Diane said. And before Corey or Marcus could say another word, she tore the check in half, then in half again. A woman in line gasped. Corey's mouth fell open. Marcus stood frozen, watching 6 weeks of paperwork, 2 years of patent filings, and the first real hope he'd had in 3 years fall onto the counter in 4 pieces. "Ma'am, why would you do that?" Marcus said, his voice tight but still controlled. "When I offered you every piece of documentation to verify it first?" Diane didn't answer him directly. Instead, she looked toward the security guard near the entrance. "I think it would be best if you left the premises," she said. "We take attempted fraud very seriously here." "I didn't attempt anything," Marcus said. "I walked in with a legitimate check and you didn't even look at the papers in my hand." "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to step away from the counter." Marcus looked down at the torn pieces of paper on the counter, at Diane's folded arms, at the security guard now walking toward him, and he felt something old and familiar settle over him. The particular exhaustion of being looked at and judged before a single fact was heard. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue further. He simply gathered the torn pieces of the check with careful hands, as if they still mattered, folded them into his jacket pocket beside the contract she'd never even glanced at, and said quietly, "I'll be back. And you're going to want to have looked at those papers by then." He walked out of the bank with his head up, past the customers who were still staring, past Corey, who looked like he wanted to say something and didn't know how. Nobody in that lobby knew that 11 minutes later, everything was about to turn upside down. Marcus sat in his truck in the parking lot for a long moment before he called the number on his contract. His hands weren't shaking from fear. He'd been through worse than a torn piece of paper. He'd buried his wife, raised a daughter alone, built something out of nothing in the back corner of a machine shop when no one was watching. A torn check was a problem. It wasn't the end of anything. He called the legal contact listed on his licensing agreement, a woman named Patricia Olson from the manufacturing company's corporate office, and explained calmly what had happened. "They tore it? The physical check?" Patricia said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Yes, ma'am. Didn't look at a single document. Didn't ask for my ID beyond confirming my name. Just decided." There was a pause on the line, and then Patricia said something that surprised him. "Mr. Reed, I need you to stay right where you are. Don't leave the bank parking lot. I'm making a call." Marcus didn't fully understand why until later, until he learned that First Continental Bank wasn't just any bank. It was the primary commercial banking partner for the manufacturing conglomerate that had just licensed his patent, the regional director overseeing that very branch, a man named Gregory Halden, sat on business development calls with that same company every quarter, and Marcus Reed's invention, the pressure failure safety valve now being rolled out across dozens of industrial plants, had just become one of the most talked about acquisitions in the company's engineering division. Marcus didn't know any of that. All he knew was that 15 minutes later, while he sat in his truck deciding whether to go back in or drive straight to another branch across town, a black sedan pulled into the lot, and a man in a charcoal suit stepped out and walked briskly toward the entrance, phone pressed to his ear. Marcus watched him go inside. Then, after a breath, he got out of his truck too. He wasn't going to let this go. He had done nothing wrong, and he wasn't going to let anyone make him feel like he had. He walked back through those same glass doors with his head high, torn check pieces and contracts still folded carefully in his jacket pocket. Inside, the lobby had gone strangely still. Gregory Halden was standing at the teller counter, and Diane Whitfield's face had drained of every ounce of the confidence she'd carried 20 minutes earlier. She was talking fast, gesturing at something on the counter, the torn pieces of paper Corey had apparently kept, unsure what else to do with them. And that's when Gregory turned, saw Marcus walk through the door, and his entire posture changed. He crossed the lobby in 6 long strides, hand already extended. "Mr. Reed," he said, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I just got off the phone with Patricia Olson. Please, come sit down. Can I get you a coffee? Water?" The word landed in that lobby like a stone dropped into still water. "Sir." Diane Whitfield's mouth opened and nothing came out. Gregory Halden had been in banking for 22 years, and in that time he'd learned one lesson that guided almost everything he did. The person standing in front of you is very rarely who you assume they are, and the moment you stop asking, you stop doing your job. He guided Marcus to a private office at the back of the branch, ignoring the stares of the customers still lingering in the lobby, and closed the door. "Mr. Reed, I want you to know this is not how we operate, and it is not who we are," Gregory said, sitting across from him rather than behind the desk. A small gesture, but one Marcus noticed. "I've just spoken with our corporate partners. I know about the patent. I know about the valve technology. Frankly, half our commercial accounts department has been talking about the licensing deal for weeks. You're the reason 4 of our largest manufacturing clients are updating their safety systems this quarter." Marcus set the torn pieces of the check on the desk between them. Along with his contract, his patent documentation, and his ID, laid out the way he'd tried to lay them out 20 minutes earlier for a woman who never once looked at them. "I offered all of this," Marcus said quietly. "She didn't ask for a single piece of it." Gregory looked down at the papers, and something tightened in his jaw. "I know, and I'm not going to make excuses for that. What happened to you today was wrong, and it was based on nothing but what she decided to see when she looked at you. That's not caution. That's bias. And it has no place in how we treat any customer who walks through that door. Deal worth $5 or $5 million. Marcus didn't say anything right away. He'd heard apologies before, plenty of them, mostly empty. He wasn't sure yet what kind this one was. "Mr. Reed," Gregory continued, "I'd like to reissue that check personally today. And I'd like your permission to open a private banking relationship for you, the kind we normally reserve for our commercial partners. Given the scope of your licensing agreement, and frankly given what just happened, I think it's the least this branch owes you." "I'm not looking for special treatment," Marcus said. "I just wanted to deposit a check." "I understand that," Gregory said. "And you should have been able to do exactly that without anyone deciding you didn't belong here first." Marcus finally allowed himself to exhale, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "Then let's start with that," he said. "Start with just treating people like people. The rest we can figure out." Gregory nodded slowly, and for the first time that morning, something like respect passed between the two of them. Not the kind that came from titles or dollar amounts, but the kind 2 men earn when one owns a mistake and the other refuses to let it define him. Diane Whitfield was called into that office 20 minutes later. She walked in already talking, already explaining, the way people do when they sense the ground shifting beneath them and think words might slow the fall. Mr. Halden, I was following fraud protocol. We've had issues with counterfeit checks before. I was only trying to protect the branch. Diane, Gregory said, his voice calm but final. Did you ask Mr. Reed for any documentation before you destroyed his check? Silence. Did you look at his ID beyond confirming his name? More silence. Did you call the number on the licensing contract he offered you? The way our fraud protocol actually requires, verifying with the issuing company before making a decision? Diane's eyes flicked to Marcus, then back to Gregory. No, she said finally, quietly. I didn't. Then this wasn't protocol, Gregory said. This was a decision you made the moment he walked up to that counter, before he said a word. I've reviewed the branch camera footage already. You didn't examine that check for fraud markers. You examined him. Diane had no answer for that, because there wasn't one that would hold. Gregory didn't shout. He didn't need to. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full review by corporate. I want you to think very carefully, in that time, about how many other customers have walked into this branch and been judged before they were heard. Because today, it happened to a man who just handed this bank one of the most significant commercial relationships we've built all year. And he's not the only one it's happened to. He's just the one whose paperwork I could verify with one phone call. Diane looked at Marcus then, and for a moment something flickered across her face. Not quite an apology, but the beginning of one, the kind that comes only after a person is forced to see themselves clearly. I'm sorry, she said, and her voice cracked slightly. I judged you the second you walked in, and I didn't even give you the chance to prove me wrong. That's on me. Not on protocol, just on me. Marcus studied her for a long moment. He wasn't a man who carried anger well. It sat too heavy in him, took up room he needed for other things, for Amara, for his work, for the life he was building. But he also wasn't a man who accepted apologies just to make a room feel comfortable again. I appreciate you saying that, he said finally, but an apology doesn't undo what happened in that lobby in front of everybody. I hope you use this, whatever happens next, to actually see people before you decide who they are. Not just me. Everybody who walks through that door not dressed the way you expect. Diane nodded, unable to hold his gaze, and left the office without another word. By that afternoon, the new check had been issued, the deposit processed, and Gregory personally walked Marcus through setting up an account structure that made sense for someone about to start receiving ongoing royalty payments. Something Marcus, despite 2 years of patent paperwork, had never had to think through before. But it was what happened after the paperwork that stayed with Marcus longer than the money did. Corey, the young teller who'd been the first to greet him that morning, caught up with him near the entrance as he was leaving. Mr. Reed, Corey said, a little nervous. I just wanted to say I should have stood up for you back there. I saw what she was doing and I didn't say anything. And I'm sorry for that. Marcus looked at him, young, earnest, clearly shaken by the whole morning, and felt none of the anger he might have expected to feel. You kept the pieces of the check, Marcus said. That mattered more than you know. A lot of people would have just thrown them in the trash and moved on. You didn't. Corey seemed surprised that Marcus had noticed something so small in the middle of everything else. I just figured it wasn't right, what was happening. I didn't know what else to do. Sometimes that's enough, Marcus said. Noticing what's not right, even when you don't know how to fix it yet. Just don't let it be enough forever. Next time, say something. It doesn't have to be loud, just honest. Corey nodded like he'd remember that for a long time. Marcus drove home that evening with the weight of the day still sitting in his chest. But underneath it, something steadier. A kind of proof he hadn't needed but had been given anyway. That the work he'd done in the back of a machine shop after 9-hour shifts, the 2 years of paperwork done on library computers, the years of telling Amara that things would get better, none of it had been imagined. None of it had needed anyone's permission to be real, even when a woman in a gray blazer decided it couldn't be. Amara was waiting for him on the front steps of the apartment building when he pulled up, her backpack still on, clearly having been told by a neighbor to wait outside for him. She ran up to the truck the second he opened the door. Daddy, did you get the money? Did the bank thing work? Marcus knelt down in front of her, right there on the sidewalk, and pulled her into a hug that lasted a little longer than usual. "It worked, baby," he said. "It took a little longer than it should have. Somebody in there decided who I was before they let me show them. But it worked out. And you know what mattered more than the check?" "What?" Amara asked. "That I didn't let anybody's wrong idea about me change who I actually am," Marcus said. "That's the part that matters most. The money's good. It's going to help us a lot. But you remember that part. The staying yourself part. That's the part nobody can tear up." Amara nodded seriously. The way 9-year-olds do when they're trying to hold on to something important, even if they don't fully understand it yet. In the weeks after that day at the bank, Marcus found himself leaning on people he hadn't realized were paying attention all along. Amara's 3rd-grade teacher, Ms. Renata Sanders, had known the Reeds for 2 years by then, long enough to have noticed the quiet, steady way Marcus showed up to every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every fundraiser, even on nights when Marcus had clearly come straight from a double shift, still faintly smelling of cutting oil. Tie loosened over a shirt he'd changed into in his truck. When the story broke in the local paper, Renata sent him a short message, nothing dramatic, just that she'd read it, that she was proud of how he'd carried himself, and that Amara talked about him like he'd hung the moon, which, she added, told her most of what she needed to know about the kind of father he was. They'd known each other only as parent and teacher before that. But small conversations at pickup time turned into longer ones. She asked about the consultancy he was building. He asked about the mural project she was trying to get funded for the school's east hallway, one that kept getting denied by a budget committee that never seemed to have room for the arts. Without much fanfare, Marcus wrote the check that got the mural built, on the condition that nobody put his name on it. "You don't want the credit?" Renata asked him, half teasing, the day the scaffolding went up. "I spent a long time being seen for the wrong reasons," Marcus said. "For once I'd like something to just be good, without anybody needing to know it was me." It wasn't a grand romance, not the kind built for a single dramatic scene. It grew slowly, the way real things tend to, through pickup line conversations, through a shared laugh at Amara's increasingly elaborate science fair presentations, through the unspoken comfort of being around someone who had never once needed an explanation for who Marcus was before deciding he was worth knowing. Amara noticed before either of them said anything out loud. "Miss Sanders laughs at all your jokes now," she told her father one evening, far too pleased with her own observation. "Even the bad ones." "All my jokes are good," Marcus said. "Daddy." "Fine, most of them." He didn't rush anything. He'd learned in the years since Danielle that some things couldn't be forced into someone else's timeline, and he wasn't interested in filling a space just to have it filled. But for the first time in a long while, the house felt less like something he was holding together alone, and more like something that was slowly being built back up around him, not to replace what he'd lost, but to stand alongside it. The story of what happened at First Continental Bank didn't stay contained to that branch for long. Corey, still shaken by what he'd witnessed, mentioned it to a friend who worked at a local news outlet, not to cause trouble, but because he couldn't stop thinking about the calm way Marcus had stood there, refusing to shrink, refusing to raise his voice, refusing to let a torn piece of paper convince him of anything less than what he already knew was true. A local reporter reached out to Marcus for comment. He almost said no. He'd never wanted attention. He built things quietly, raised his daughter quietly, grieved quietly. But he thought about Corey standing there, unsure how to speak up. He thought about how many other people walked into rooms every day and were judged before they said a word, without a corporate legal contact on the other end of a phone to set things right. So he said yes, not for himself, for every person who wouldn't get a regional director walking through the door at exactly the right moment. The story ran with the headline that would later travel far beyond the local paper. A bank manager had torn up a legitimate $5 million check belonging to a black single father, a self-taught inventor who'd spent 2 years filing his own patent paperwork after his daughter went to bed, because he didn't look, in her eyes, like someone who could have earned it. The story struck a nerve nationwide, not because it was rare, but because so many people recognized some version of it, the assumption made in a store, a restaurant, an office lobby, before a single word was spoken. First Continental Bank issued a public statement acknowledging what had happened, confirming Diane Whitfield's termination following the internal review, and announcing a new company-wide training program on unconscious bias in customer interactions. One that, at Gregory Halden's insistence, Marcus was invited to help shape. Marcus agreed, on one condition, that the training center actual stories, not just policy slides, that employees understand not just what not to do, but why it matters, what it costs a person quietly to be underestimated in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. He spent 3 weekends helping Gregory's team build the first module, sitting across a conference table from HR staff and branch managers from all over the region, walking them through exactly what those 4 minutes had felt like from the inside. The moment Diane's eyes moved over his jacket, the moment she decided not to reach for the folder in his hand, the specific, quiet violence of being spoken to as though he needed to be handled rather than heard. One branch manager, a woman named Felicia who ran a location 2 counties over, raised her hand partway through and admitted something that made the whole room go still. "I've done that," she said. "Not exactly like this, but I've made a version of that decision before I had all the facts. I never thought about what it cost the person standing in front of me. I just thought about protecting the branch." "That's exactly the thing," Marcus told her. "Protecting the branch and respecting the person in front of you were never supposed to be opposites. The moment you treat them like they are, you've already decided the customer is the threat, instead of the fraud you're actually supposed to be watching for." By the end of the first year, First Continental had rolled the training out to every branch in the region, and 2 other regional banks reached out asking to license a version of the same program. An irony that wasn't lost on Marcus, a man who now had 2 licensing deals to his name instead of 1, this time for something no patent office could ever measure. With the licensing royalties now flowing steadily, Marcus didn't quit his job at the machine shop right away. He kept working there for another 8 months, training 2 younger machinists in the fundamentals Walt had once taught him, before finally stepping back to focus on a new project, a small engineering consultancy he named Reed Safety Systems, built specifically to help smaller manufacturers afford the kind of protective technology that used to be priced only for the largest plants. He hired Walt as a consultant. He hired Corey, too, who had left banking within the year to study mechanical engineering, something he later told Marcus he'd wanted to do since he was a teenager but never believed he could afford. Until watching one man refuse to be diminished reminded him that some things are worth pursuing even when the path looks impossible. He moved him and Amara into a house with a real yard, the kind she'd drawn in crayon years earlier without either of them believing it was anything more than a picture. The someday jar still sat on the kitchen counter of the new house, empty now, kept not because they needed it anymore, but because Marcus wanted Amara to remember where they started. Diane Whitfield, for her part, took a job at a small credit union 6 months later, a demotion in title and salary, but she later told a colleague it was the first job where she made herself sit with every customer's file before forming an opinion of the person handing it to her. Whether that change was permanent, only time would tell. But it was at least a beginning. There's a simple truth at the center of what happened to Marcus Reed, one that has nothing to do with money, and everything to do with how easily people decide who someone is before they've earned the right to know. A torn check can be reissued. A patent once filed cannot be undone. But the moment of humiliation, the moment someone is made to feel small in front of strangers because of how they look rather than who they are, that moment leaves a mark no apology fully erases. What made Marcus's story resonate wasn't the $5 million. It was the fact that he never once raised his voice to prove his worth. He didn't need to shout to be right. He simply stood there, steady, dignified, and let the truth catch up to the room in its own time. That's the real lesson here. Character doesn't announce itself through appearance, and worth was never meant to be judged by a jacket, a job title, or the calluses on a man's hands. The people who matter most in our lives, the Coreys of the world, the ones willing to say, "I should have stood up," are proof that decency doesn't require power. It only requires the willingness to notice and the courage to say something when it counts. Marcus Reed didn't need anyone to call him sir to know who he was. But it mattered all the same that eventually someone finally did. Because that's the thing about dignity. It was never something that needed to be granted for it to exist. Marcus had it the entire time, standing at that counter with a folder full of proof nobody would look at. He had it in the machine shop at 2 a.m, sketching pressure valves in a dollar store notebook. He had it every night at the kitchen table, tracing his finger under his daughter's homework, promising her without ever saying the words out loud that he would not let the world's assumptions become her inheritance. What changed that day wasn't who Marcus was. What changed was that for a few minutes, the room finally caught up to it. And maybe that's the real reason stories like this one travel so far. So fast, touching strangers who've never set foot in that bank and never will. Not because of the size of the check. Not even because of the apology, or the firing, or the tidy justice of it all. But because so many people watching know exactly what it feels like to stand in a room, holding the proof of who they are, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally look. Before you go, what would you have done if you were standing in that lobby? Would you have spoken up like Corey eventually did? Or stayed quiet the way so many of us are tempted to? And if you were in Marcus's shoes, hearing that word, sir, after everything you'd just been through, what do you think that moment would have felt like? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and stories like this one always spark the most powerful conversations. If this story moved you, we have another one coming in just a few days. Just as emotional, just as unforgettable. Make sure you're subscribed and that your notification bell is turned on so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs a reminder that dignity can't be torn up, no matter how hard someone tries. Thank you for watching, and for staying with Marcus's story until the very end. We'll see you in the next one.